Alright, this is my video summary of the Manhattan Project. So it's a documentary, talks about the moment in time. And so what the Manhattan Project was, it was military research in an effort to beat Hitler, because Hitler was on the rise and he was going to take over the world. There was actually a group of scientists who were not U.S. citizens, most of whom had come from Europe because they knew of Hitler, right? And they knew that the Nazis had the ability to create a weapon that could deal mass destruction. And so they petitioned the president to create this group or this project to combat that, because they thought that if they could beat Hitler to this weapon first, they could end the war. And so the Manhattan Military Engineering District was created, and the scientist that they chose to lead it was Robert Oppenheimer. Very brilliant physicist. A lot of people had trouble working with him because he was very intelligent, and it was very easy for him to make other people feel like they weren't valued because he could do it himself. But basically what the idea was they were going to start with fission reactions. They started with very small controlled ones that they then were able to go and make larger ones, and they were trying to get it to reach a critical mass, which would cause a cascading effect as atoms kind of split. And so I kind of divided it into what was it like there and during the research, and then what were the outcomes of the Manhattan Project. And so for the first one, what was it like? So it was located in Los Alamos, New Mexico, because they needed a place that they could control, that was going to be out of the way so that they could actually do these tests, but also that was far enough away from the coasts that they couldn't be attacked. So they chose New Mexico because it was a very large open area, and they didn't really care about blowing up the desert. It's pretty much what it came down to. One thing I thought was interesting was no one on base was called a physicist. Everyone was referred to as an engineer. The workload that they had was they worked 6 days a week. They would work 12 to 14-hour days, usually with Sundays off. And that's when most people would kind of throw parties and they'd kind of get together, have a barbecue, whatever. When it came down to it, the main thing that they had a problem with was the actual engineering aspect of it. They thought that they had the physics part of it down and how to actually split it and what the critical mass was, but it was how were they going to house uranium and plutonium in a shell that could be transported in a plane without exploding. And so they would refine the uranium in Chicago, they'd get the plutonium from Chicago, and then in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, they'd get uranium. Some of the other things about the project, it was very strict on security. You weren't allowed to travel more than 100 miles off of base, which was interesting. And then you weren't allowed to discuss any of the work that you were doing with anyone, not even family. In 1944, they actually started getting the materials, and they started to make prototypes and kind of test different housings. And then they did a TNT test to mimic kind of the size and the damage, and then see what an implosion would look like. That opened the door for their initial test, which was really just the one test that they did, because the plutonium itself cost hundreds of millions of dollars. What was cool with that test was when they did it, they had projected pretty much down to like how big of an explosion it was going to be, but there was a lot more light than they thought there would be. The other thing that they described was that it echoed. And that's probably, it was kind of just this roar. And as I was thinking about it, I think it's just because it's one atom after the next, just 1, 2, 3, and they're just constantly being destroyed. And it's just this cascading effect. So it wasn't just one boom. There was the explosion, then, and it was little explosions after that. A lot of people talked about the heat that they felt. The tower that they dropped it from was completely vaporized. The sand actually had become like a glassy substance. It was estimated at 21 kilotons. And the quote that I liked from Robert Oppenheimer was, when they asked him what it was like, he quoted a scripture and he said, "Behold, I am death, the destroyer of worlds." And he said that that's what most people felt like when they were there. Is they made this huge accomplishment, but at the same time they were like, wow, this is a destroyer of worlds. And so the overall effect was they dropped the bombs on Japan. Some of the scientists that worked on the project actually protested that and thought that we should demonstrate the power but not actually drop it. What was cool was Oppenheimer actually supported the military and said, look, our job was to make the weapon. Now that it's out of our hands, it's a military and a political decision. We have no place to argue. And so the ultimate effect was that because of the atomic bomb being dropped, because of the Manhattan Project and the work that they did, the United States was able to win the war, and it ended World War II. And it's opened the door to a lot of different things like nuclear power. But it all started right there in New Mexico, with engineers that were working hard. So, very cool, very rich part of history, and yeah.